This is an old HiWatt. This is a very old HiWatt. It's got Harry Joyce's signature on it, or at least his initials. And I have worked on this amp, but it was in 2017, so it's been 7 years. And it's been going strong since then, but it has developed a problem. And the owner said the tubes were red plating. He put in some new tubes, they red plated. He had a buddy of his look at it, and they said that it didn't have the bias voltage, or the bias voltage wasn't being adjusted, wasn't turning with the pot. I said, well, stop, don't do anything, bring it to me. And he did. So before I started this video, I've already powered the amp on without these tubes in place and verified that we have the correct negative voltage at pin 5. There does not seem to be any leaking DC from the old Phillips mustard coupling caps in the output of the phase inverter. And we do have a bias voltage, and I have set it to its most negative, and I'm going to power it on my current limiter and watch these tubes and see what happens, and I'll be ready to turn it right off. I've got the master at 0, everything at noon, channel volume's off. So it's powered on. Let's give it a minute. And when I had the 4 tubes out, I was checking each one for discoloration or smells or anything weird, or visible damage, darkening of the plates, etc. This one has a slight rattle to it. So while any of these could act up, this is the one I'm going to be watching the most closely. All right, well, it's been on a bit. Let's take it out of standby and see what happens. A little bit of a hum comes into the output. We're just going to watch this. And I think I'm going to do something that's bad for video. I think I'm going to turn off one of my lights so I can see any incipient cherry glow starting on a plate. Because with the studio light, which makes everything look great on camera, that amount of light can hide the beginnings of cherry stuff. So let's turn off this one. But I can always turn it back on. I'm just going to watch these in the dark. Now, I don't know how these are biased at the moment. I want to make sure we're going to have a light show first. I know that I have the bias at its most negative. So let's see what noise we have if I turn up the master. That's a good amount, by which I mean very little. So I'm going to turn this light back on. I'm going to power the amp off. And I'm going to check the bias and set the bias, and then we'll go from there. And I want to stay on the relatively cool side, say 40 to 50% while I diagnose any problems. Because I don't want to have this thing biased at 70% and then have it run away and damage a tube. These are expensive. Well, Houston, we very much have a problem here. I can't show you everything just because of screen setup and where I need the meter to be so I can see it. But with the tubes out, and the bias set is most negative. I had negative 40 volts DC present at pin 5 of each tube. And I take it out of standby. And pin 5 here measures negative 27. Negative 25, 30, negative 35, negative 36. So let me power it off and pull these output tubes and show you the same voltage measurements. I suspect that these 2 tubes have gone south. Now, what can happen when a tube fails is you get leakage at the grid from the plate or the screen. And that can really cause problems, including pulling down the grid an awful lot. And that's what seems to be happening here, where we had like 27, 25, and then 35, 37, something like that. I don't remember what the actual numbers were now. I'm tentatively touching each tube. And these two that had the lowest DC voltage present were the hottest. All right, so without the tubes, powering it back on, out of standby, so we'll have the correct bias, negative 38.5, 38.57, 38.65, 38.7. That's a fluctuation that's normal, given that the wall voltage is slightly changing. Yesterday, when I set the bias to its most negative, and I said it was negative 40, that's where the wall voltage was at 120. Right now, the wall voltage is 113, because it's one of those days here in Memphis, an old house in Midtown. In those situations, if I need to get it back to 120 for testing, I'll use my Variac. Not necessary in this case, just to test things. So I don't have any conductivity within the tube sockets. There's no problem with the tube socket. There's no problem with B+ leaking through the coupling caps in the phase inverter output, which are these two. I already checked all that. All the grid stoppers on the output tubes are within spec. They're all measured between 22 and 24K. You know, the original components, but they're still fine. The screen grids I changed out. Last time I had it in, it's got these 5-watt, 470 ohms. You can see here, 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 and here, and here, and here. I already put in those big Vichets, the 5 watts, the 7 watts, the 10 watts. You can see I put in this little bias board. Let me just address that while we're doing the little tour of the work from 2017. In stock form, this amp had way too hot a bias supply for EL34s. It was like negative 33 at its coldest, and tubes just roasted. And that's because of the tap that was being used. So I put in this little circuit, which attaches via 2 standoffs to the existing holes of this unused preamp tube location. So there's no modification permanently to the amplifier or the chassis. It's a little PCB, and I'm deriving a new bias node from the one side of the HT. And this is what you find in JCM 900s. This is what you find in the steel string stinger, whatever it is from Dumble. It's a time-tested thing where you run the incoming AC through a capacitor. In this case, it's an X-class capacitor rated for much more AC than is present. And that has a ground reference through a resistor. These are tiny, but they're 1 watts, and they're not dissipating enough heat to need larger ones. And then a pretty standard bias supply, kind of what you'd find in a Marshall, with 10 microfarad, 160 volt caps. At its most negative, this bias gets to about negative 120. So 160 volt caps are necessary. Then it's got there's a resistor between the two nodes, and then just a resistor going to this multi-turn trim pot to ground. It's a 25K pot, 47K resistor, pretty standard stuff. And this is set to its full 25K right now for the most negative bias. So it goes between negative 35-ish with no tubes present, and stays negative 35-ish on, let's call them, if from left to right in the previous thing you saw was 1, 2, 3, 4. So 3 and 4 are staying where this is going, but these two are being drawn down almost 10 more volts on 1 and 2 on those output tubes. So I strongly suspect we have bad tubes. I'm debating whether just to move the tubes to different slots and show you that the problem is going to follow the tube, not the tube socket. But given how dramatic that bias difference is, I don't want those things to run so hot that they're going to burn anything, because those two tubes are not trustworthy. I'm going to say, based on my experience, it is time to get new tubes. Now, I understand that these are a recent purchase, and I know the vendor. I'm going to contact the owner, see if he has the receipt, and contact the vendor and see what our options are, because I don't think this should have happened. This bias supply was very thoroughly tested by me, and I have tested it. And once I got the amp here yesterday, I tested it again to make sure nothing had gone wrong in it. And nothing went wrong. I went through my notes from 7 years ago, and everything was still working within the range intended. I could make it more negative, but that change with load is not due to this. Other than the fact that it's not working, and I suspect it's just tubes, the rest of it is pure amp porn. So this is the dream for HiWatts. And it looks like I did very little 7 years ago. This has been completely recapped, and it had some burnt, melted sections of wire last time. So quite a bit of the wiring in here that looks like what Harry Joyce did back in 69, 70, whatever year this was, is my work trying to replicate his. Where his did not exist, like these two wires here going from the bias and this one wire going to the bias, it is honoring the spirit of his work. And I was very proud of this. And I expect I will be again 4 new output tubes from now. So until then, thanks for watching.